and welcome to the Cinema ATL Podcast. The Cinema ATL Podcast is a weekly podcast that examines the world of entertainment through the lens of local Atlanta filmmakers. That would be us, your hosts. I'm Michael D. Friedman, and that is...
Martin Kelley.
And this week, it's another edition of Forgotten Films. Yes, normally we talk about older films in this series, but I wanted to revisit a more recent film that I don't think got as much love as it deserved, and that film is Atomic Blonde from 2017. But first, Martin, why don't you tell our listeners how they can help the podcast out?
Well, they can help us out by listening like they're doing right this minute, and then comment and rate it and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. And that could be anywhere from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Amazon, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even on YouTube. So give us some love on any of those formats. That helps us out a lot.
Yes, and we also want to hear from you. You can always tweet us at CinemaATL, or you can get us at our personal accounts. My personal account has now changed. It's at Clever Transient.
Or hit me up at Marte_real1.
And then don't forget our Instagram. It's at CinemaATL Podcast. And if you act right now, you might be our lucky 500th follower. When I checked before we recorded this, we're at 499.
Nice.
So maybe you can be lucky 500 and win...
and win our admiration.
There you go.
Or if you are old school, like some people are, you can check it out on the Legacy website, cinemaatl.com.
Yes, and we're going to get into our forgotten film, but first I want to apologize for last week when we had no episode. This is our second time recording this episode because the first time the audio was not good. And I think it was Russian hackers had something to do with it. So
I think it was. They're going around. They're getting at everybody.
I know. And it all started.
Pipelines, they're getting at our beef, and now they're getting at our podcast.
It all started with the Cold War, which leads us perfectly into our film. But let's go.
Definitely.
All right. Atomic Blonde in 2017. So, our forgotten film this week. So, if you haven't seen Atomic Blonde, I'll give you a brief synopsis here. It's an undercover MI6 agent is sent to Berlin during the Cold War to investigate the murder of a fellow agent and recover a missing list of double agents. This film was directed by David Leach and stars Charlize Theron as Lorraine, James McAvoy as Percival, along with Toby Jones, John Goodman, Sofia Boutella, Eddie Marsan, and Bill Skarsgard, amongst others. Atomic Blonde is a stylistic thriller that is gorgeous, riveting, and action-packed. So, what do I like about it, and why did I decide to do this one for our forgotten film? Well, I love the style of this movie. I love everything about the style. The cinematography by Jonathan Sela is beautiful. Every shot feels like an artistic photograph. The score by Tyler Bates and the 80s new wave songs add to the tone. It almost feels like an 80s music video at points. The costuming by Cindy Evans is terrific, which is a huge feat to get someone like me, to sit up and notice the fashion in the film. The graphical style, the blue and pink neon tones is all tremendous. Charlize Theron plays a tough-as-nails woman in a role that was meant for her. And the action. And, I could go on, but Martin, what are your thoughts?
Hated it. No, I'm just kidding. No, we talked about this.
We talked about it when we recorded it.
Exactly. We talked about it when we recorded the episode last time. But we also talked about this a couple years ago when we did our year-end review, and we both rated this number one. And yet, we still both agree that it could use some more appreciation because this movie is fantastic. There's not a false thing about this film. Like the time it's set is nostalgic, and yet it's got a lot of gravity to it. Charlize Theron, you mentioned, was fantastic. So is the rest of the cast. The action, we're going to talk about that in detail because that is something to behold. We're going to talk about some of the people who are behind the camera, who helped make this film happen. But I love the film too. And there's, like you mentioned, there's so many things to like about the film. And everything you touched on, I like about the film. I didn't notice the costumes as much because, it just felt like it was really a window into, that time period. So I didn't really even think about the costumes being so great because it's like it just naturally, washed over me that they were period, ready and period perfect and fantastic. I mean, One of the things I really like about it, and I'll just go into a little quick story about that time period. I was actually in Europe as a young person during that time frame. So I was in Germany, and not in Berlin, obviously, because you couldn't be in Berlin unless you were specifically based at that one particular base. But
Right.
we were really well aware of the Cold War, unlike most people, because that's the whole purpose of why we were over there in terms of being an army brat. So our parents were serving, and just being ready for that Cold War to break out at any point. And so the tensions were really, really real. And so it really captures it. And I appreciated the fact that there was a movie done, set in that time period, because a lot of people kind of forget about it. I mean,
Right.
it's not that far away. You know what I mean? From when this was a real thing, the Cold War and the tensions around it. And yet we feel, there's a lot of things that happened since. So I guess that's part of why we forget about it. But it certainly was a historic time.
Well, it's interesting because there have been, especially recently, a lot of nostalgic 80s type movies, but those all like tend to, focus on the things you think about with pop culture and the
Right.
80s and,
Hmm.
the music and the fashion and the TV shows and all that stuff. This takes a look at kind of the real 80s, if you ask
Hmm.
me,
Hmm.
in that regard. And I remember, being a kid growing up in the 80s, and I wasn't living in that area. I was living in Ohio at the time, and but that was a thing that was always on people in the back of people's minds. This Cold War, and our is a nuclear war going to start, and you'd have nightmares as a kid about nuclear war and things like that, and you
Right.
always felt like we were right on the edge. And this kind of really brings that kind of feel back to it, but it also brings it back in the 80s fashion. With like I mentioned before, like the 80s songs in this,
Right. Oh
the
yeah, yeah.
soundtrack to this is just terrific, and
Exactly.
especially the European side of those 80s songs,
Yes.
99
Yes.
Left
Absolutely.
Balloons and stuff like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
It's just really fits, and it's really the the it really gives you that feel of being in that Cold War scenario in the 80s.
Definitely, and I guess what I'll say is it captures that fine line, because we're talking about, the fact that it captures a gravity about the '80s that we know existed, and yet doesn't really, fit in a lot of the nostalgic movies that about the '80s. But at the same time, it's nostalgic enough, so it can still make you feel good about the '80s and some of the things you remember, and still have that gravity. So that's
Right.
that's kudos to the filmmaking team and the people behind it. And so let's talk a little bit about them real quick before we start talking about specifics about the movie. So I guess the director, David Leach, he's done Deadpool 2. He's been a stunt coordinator and some amazing stunt work, but we'll talk about it specifically in here. The screenplay um, by Kurt Johnstad, who did also. This is actually what adapted from a graphic novel as
Right.
well, and he's got a lot of experience in that. He did the screenplay for 300 and 300 Rise of an Empire, so he's certainly got a lot of experience and does a great job with
Right.
capturing graphic novels to the screen. So
Yeah.
uh, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, the graphic novel is called "The Coldest City." It was written by Anthony Johnston and art by Sam Hart. So if you're looking for the Atomic Blonde comic book, you're not going to find it if you're if you're interested. It's called "The Coldest City." I believe there's a sequel out to it too, which we'll talk a little bit about possible sequels to Atomic Blonde. But and then of course the cinematographer, which I mentioned in my opening, Jonathan Sela.
Hmm.
He's also done. He also did John Wick. He did Deadpool 2 after this,
Hmm.
and it's just his some of the shots. And I talked about this. Um, that some of the shots just look like they're from a photograph. Like you could like
Right.
take any still in this film, and it would be great in a photography book, in my
Absolutely.
opinion.
Hmm.
And then I
Hmm.
also mentioned the fact that like sometimes you feel like you're in an 80s music video, and
Right.
that once again a credit to the cinematography and some of the stylistic choices he makes. There's a scene where she's um, flying to Germany from London, and it's done to this musical number. I don't remember what the song is, but it just feels like an 80s music video. The way she's on this plane, she's in high
Right.
fashion, and then
Yeah.
she gets to the airport, and the way the guy like stamps her visa and all this stuff. It's just, I mean, I'm blown away by the cinematography in this. And what I like about it is, like I said, the neon hues to it, and just how it's dark in places. You know, it feels really cold, like Cold War. You know, coldest city.
Right.
It's based off the coldest city. It feels like you're in the middle of the Cold War. You're in Berlin, which is really just kind of, especially East Berlin, is kind of run down, but you still have these elements of like this pops of neon and blues and
Right.
pinks and
Right.
the scene
No,
where
but
she's in her hotel room. It's just like I'm gushing over it.
right. No, totally. Like I understand what you mean about the cinematography putting you in the place, and yet being so stylistic and yet realistic. It's like when I was in the theater, I almost felt like I was going to see my breath because it did feel cold,
Right,
in certain times and places. So again, yeah, superlative effort by everybody involved, and um, one of the best things about it was the action, which
right,
is not surprising from the director who's got so much stunt coordinator experience. But I think he put all of his skills to the test here, and he just really pulls off some of the
right,
best fight sequences I've ever seen, just because they look so good and real at the same time. It's like some fight sequences are good because they're really well coordinated and choreographed and they just look good. Well, these look good, but they
right,
also look agonizing. Like these
right.
people are really fighting and getting hurt. I mean, it's just like something to behold. And the some of the shots and the sustained coordination of these
Right.
fight sequences are unbelievable.
Well,
I mean, or seemingly, yeah, seemingly.
there's a 7 minute long fight sequence that takes
Yeah,
place in this, like, I guess, apartment building.
yeah.
Um, it's literally 7 minutes long. You can actually look it up on YouTube if you don't want to. You need to watch the whole film, but if you just want to
Right,
see the fight scene, you can find it on YouTube. And it's one continuous take. But I mean, it looks like it's one continuous take. You know,
right,
there's cuts in there that they cleverly hide, but it adds to the realness of it. Like, you can really feel like Charlize Theron like taking on these guys, and they make it believable that, and
right,
she's getting hurt the whole time. It's not like she's Superwoman,
right.
or Wonder Woman, or yeah, she's really. I mean, she's put through the grinder. I mean,
Mhm,
it's
mhm.
intense how much goes on in it, and it's just an incredible sequence. I mean, it's just one of many. I mean, it really kicks off. The movie kicks off with this sequence in the car when she gets to
Right.
Berlin. That's just terrific,
Mhm.
and the way she gets out of the situation there, and then and then she meets she meets James McAvoy's character right after that, and the
Mhm, mhm.
introduction between the two is really really great, and it just
Yep.
comes right out of that fight sequence, and it's just the fight sequence, the way she uses like objects and stuff. It reminds me kind of a little bit of like a less cartoony Jackie Chan, a little bit,
Mm, mhm,
right?
mhm,
You know,
mhm.
like there's one scene where she's just like using a rope to
Right.
fight off these guys,
Mhm.
and the way she uses it is just really cool. There's just a lot of really good fight scenes in this.
Yeah, true, true. I mean, that's funny you mentioned that because yeah, obviously, Jackie Chan, he gets away with a lot because we've seen him get away with a lot, and so we believe he could actually do some of the stuff he does.
Right.
But you're right; it's not that outrageous to make it more believable. And so it's still exciting and awesome, but at the same time, it's toned down just enough. The choreography toned down just enough to be completely believable. And so that's what's so really good about it. And Charlize is just fantastic at performing it too, as well as
Yeah.
James McAvoy and everyone else. But terrific fight scenes. And again, we're gushing about the fight scenes, but the movie itself has got a great plot, and it's set against one of the seminal events of our lifetime, basically, which is the tearing down of the Berlin Wall.
So let's talk about the plot a little bit. Yeah, since you brought it up, I I I I think the plot's great, but I do think this might be why this movie hasn't been was widely regarded as it could be, because there's a lot going on in the plot. There's a lot of double crossing and triple crossing, characters that you don't really know a lot about that turn out to have other goals in mind and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be confusing to some people that may have watched it, like, not paying full attention to it, or, I don't find it confusing, but I could understand why some people might have. I think that might be, and to me though, like the plot is almost secondary. Like
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
just love the look of the film and the way things are shot, and the action and all the other things that we mentioned. Like the plot to me could have been way simpler and still been an enjoyable movie, but I think that adds to it the fact that you don't really always know what's going on until the very end, and I think that's great.
No, I think that's right. I think that's what I also appreciate a lot about it is that this could have been on on its surface. It could have been, and I'm gonna denigrate a film that everyone loves, but John Wick. I mean, it's pretty light on plot. You know what I'm saying?
Right,
Everybody
right.
likes the movie still. This could have been John Wickish in the sense that we could have just seen Charlize Theron kick ass and and take names, and that would have been a satisfying movie on in and of itself. But the fact that this actually does have a plot and it's a little bit complicated, and I agree, some people may have gotten confused at certain points. I don't think it's fair to say that it's confusing because it really shouldn't be. But at the same time, I think it's complicated enough to keep your attention, even if you're not an appreciator of fights and stuff like that.
I mean, I totally agree. I'm just trying to figure out why it didn't resonate with the
Right, right,
viewers as much as I think it should have. And I think that's the only thing. That's the only thing I can think of. And that, or maybe people aren't as in tune with what was going on in the Cold War as we are. We're the
right,
right age for it because we were growing up in that.
right.
Anybody our age or older is probably going to appreciate it.
Hmm. Hmm.
We're probably the sweet spot because
Right,
we're
because we
like
were
the
so
action.
young and
We're
we just
young and
remember it. Yeah, exactly.
we grew up with action movies and things like
Right,
that. So like the older generation from us might not appreciate the action part or
right,
violence as much.
right, right,
But I believe if you're a younger viewer or listener to this podcast, I mean, I think you could still appreciate it, and I think you could really get a feel. Uh, like we said, I think you could really get a feel for what the tone was at the time.
right, right. No, totally. And I think you're right. I think you hit upon what I think the real issue was is the fact that people we just mentioned, I think that people don't really appreciate that era as much anymore because we're long past it, in certain ways. And of course, we had a whole new era happen, right after about 10 years later, a whole new era kicked
Right,
off, that everyone's been consumed with since then. It's up until about right now, which I guess is a new era. But yeah, the era is kind of bygone. So the language of it, like people aren't as familiar with it. So the younger viewers probably don't know enough about it to really appreciate it. And yet that may be why it didn't resonate quite as much as we think it should have.
right, right. Well, let's talk about the characters a little bit more. I mean, we talked about Charlize Theron, and I feel like this is just kind of the movie that was like perfect for her. Like this was like made for her, and it turns out it might
Absolutely.
have been made for her. But you know what I mean? Like it's like I can't imagine another actress doing this role. She's just like picture perfect in it, and she's a great actress, but she's also got that physical presence, and she's
Right.
done these action films before, and she has that commanding presence to her, and I think she just fills right in. And
And I think what people don't understand, about physicality is she's a former dancer, and I think that really helps people with action roles because Jackie Chan actually was trained in in dance as a youngster. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
a lot of people, maybe don't appreciate how graceful it is. That she is even with this rough and tumble part. But yeah, you're right. She was made for this role, or this role was made for her, basically. Uh,
right,
b- but James McAvoy, again,
yeah, he's
terrific.
terrific. Yeah,
He's really terrific in this part.
yeah, I love
And
his character in this.
yeah, totally. And John Goodman as the American CIA, guy who is
Yeah,
perfect, perfect
just
for
the
this.
opening sequence between her and him, and when they're in the interview room with Toby Jones is in there as well,
Right, right.
and she calls him a word that I won't say, and the way he reacts to it, and he's like, "What did you say?" And like he's like, "I didn't say anything." He's like, "Well, let's." I don't know. She's like, roll the tape back. What do you want?
Right, right.
It's just like that. Their interaction is like terrific in that, and
Hmm, hmm.
um, to go back to James McAvoy too, I think like I love the fact that his character is like a fuck up, but also really good at his job at the same time.
Yes. Hmm,
I love
hmm.
that layer of his character. And is he
Definitely.
being a fuck up just to be that good? Right? Is it all
Yeah. Is
just
it
a
part of it?
ploy?
Is it part of
Right?
the plan? Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
I love that. Sofia Boutella is a really interesting character in this as well. And if you are a fan of, let's say, women making out, you might enjoy a
I don't know.
certain
You could.
scene in
You
this
you
movie
could get
that's.
into it, maybe.
I don't want to go stoop to that level, but it's a very interesting scene. Very,
Definitely, definitely. And
very
she's very very lovely screen presence as well.
right,
And her character, it brings a little bit of all of the characters are supposed to be, hardened sort of operators, right?
right,
But she brings that touch of innocence
right,
to the role that really kind of works really well in that plot line for
right.
sure.
The naivete, right?
Hmm,
Like,
hmm.
yeah, and I think you inexperienced, but knows more than you might think at the when you first meet her. And I think that's great about all the characters in here. Like you can give them the surface level when you
Hmm.
first meet them as a character, and then as the movie goes on, you unpeel some of those layers and you see there's a lot more to them.
Yep.
Even like Eddie Marsan's character, who they're just you know he's kind of like the, I don't know what you would call him, like
Almost a MacGuffin
the
in a
almost the
way.
MacGuffin. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
almost the MacGuffin, but he has layers too, right? So
Exactly. Exactly.
that's what I just love about this movie. There's so many. It's like you can't just pinpoint one thing about a character, and that's them, right?
Right.
Um, and it's the same thing with the movie. You can't just pinpoint one thing about the movie that makes it work. It all works in concert, and it all works so well.
Right. Right. Which is what's, so really impressive about the job that the director did, because,
Right,
his experience is all action, right? But he had enough skill, filmmaking skill to make everything else work too, not just the action. And
right,
so, kudos to David Leach for taking on a movie as complex, even with all the action, which he was certainly ready to do. But the fact that everything else works, like you mentioned, and works so well, is just kind of kudos to him as a filmmaker.
all right. Well, one thing I want to say, kind of touch on before we wrap up, is that there is talk of a possible sequel coming from Netflix about for this movie. They announced it last April, so who knows what's happened since then. But
Right.
um, to me, like if they bring back the core of this filmmaking
Hmm.
team, like it's like
Oh yeah.
definitely Charlize Theron's going to come back, but like you said, David Leach needs to come back, and Jonathan Seeley needs to come back. They need to, if they can keep those together. I'm totally down for a sequel to it. Now, like I said, it's going to be a little bit different than the sequel to The Coldest City, the graphic novel it's adapted from, because they took certain liberties in the film and changed things that wouldn't make the sequel work out. Uh, they couldn't directly adapt the sequel, but I'm
Right.
sure there's the source, the nugget of what that sequel's about could be, changed, and maybe Kurt Johnstad again could do another adaptation of that, or they can go off in a different route. We'll see what happens, but I'm real interested, and I hope that, like, hopefully a sequel comes out, and hopefully that sequel brings more people to come to watch the original,
Definitely.
because
De-
that seems to
definitely.
be what Netflix does. They buy up things, the rights to things, and then people get hooked on the originals. Like Cobra Kai was like on
Right.
YouTube Red forever, and nobody paid attention to it, but then they bought it. Or
Yep. Yep.
Lucifer, they did the same thing with that.
Hmm.
So I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
No, definitely. I'm certainly for it. I'd love to see this team collaborate once again on another movie. And knowing nothing about the graphic novels, either one of them,
Right.
I
I don't
certainly,
either. I just
yeah,
know
I
what I read.
certainly, would be open to exploring this character and see where it, where it goes.
It's got to stay in the 80s, though, if you ask me. Like, I don't want it to get out of that Cold War period. I mean,
well, I think it would be early. It wouldn't have to be early 90s, basically. Right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, so I mean, I don't think it's not revealing anything from the film that this takes place like right before the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Right.
So it would have to be after that, but that's not. The Cold War was still going on even after the Berlin Wall fell.
Right.
So I think late 80s.
The sort of the fallout from that.
Yes, I think the fallout
would be really interesting for sure.
Could be ripe for because I mean, if the Soviet Union's falling apart, it's rife for like people to break away from the old Soviet Union and having all these different other things pop up that could cause things.
Definitely.
But yeah, if they could keep that tone, I'm all in.
Oh, definitely. No doubt about it. So I think, again, we know that this is a recent movie, and we know it's not necessarily forgotten in the sense that some of the other ones that we've done is forgotten. But we both really do think this movie should be on your radar if you missed it for some reason.
Right. You need to check it out if you haven't already. I mean, it's forgotten in the fact that I don't think even when it was out, a lot of people didn't really.
Well, that's a testament to the fact that it wasn't in anybody else's conversation other than ours that year about the best movies. Right. You know what I mean? It really, I mean, maybe one or two people had it on their list, but they were talking about other movies that year, and I don't even remember what other movies they were talking about that year because we both were clearly taken with this one.
Right.
So.
Right. Yep. Who knows what we were young and naive in 2017.
Exactly. Like we still are. We're still young and naive in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, maybe naive. I don't know about young. But, anyway, I guess it's time to wrap up. Thank you for listening, and we apologize for being off last week. I'm blaming Russian hackers again.
Right.
Now that you know the story of what's going on,
Definitely.
I think it's safe to say that that's what happened.
Right? I think it's you need to accept it. I think that needs to be the story. That needs to be the story.
I might have a target on my head now for saying that, but I mean, if Russian hackers want to come after us,
you better change all your passwords. I think.
Yeah,
I think you need to change all your passwords.
But anyway, thanks again for joining us. Thank you to Eureka Failure for providing the music as they do each and every week. Check them out at eurekafailure.bandcamp.com. Definitely. Always, please share and comment wherever you find this podcast. We could really use your help promoting it even more. And like I said, we got 499 followers on Instagram. You could be 500 if it hasn't happened already.
Definitely. You should be.
You should be, because we do cool stuff on Instagram. And then, so Martin, now that we're wrapping up, what's your final words of wisdom?
It's funny that the Russians hacked also my last words of wisdom from that recording. So so I have to come up with a new one. And so the new one is the difference between the impossible and the possible lies in a person's determination. And that's, straight from baseball season and Tommy Lasorda. So I agree with that. And there's not much that is impossible, but it does mean you got to put in work.
That's true. And the other difference between impossible and possible is M.
Correct.
So, it's actually I'm, right? So maybe if you take the I, maybe don't focus so much on your. I don't know.
I think yes.
I'm trying to go somewhere with it that's not going to go anywhere. It's going to go down a dark path, and we don't need to go there.
Let's not do that.
Anyway, that's it for this week. We'll see you again next week, hoping that if the Russians don't hack me.
Yes.
But thanks for sticking with us, and we'll see you again. Bye.